On January 11th, 1987, a group of children playing in Daly City, California, came upon the body of a young woman concealed in the bushes in front of a residence. They alerted authorities, and the San Mateo County coroner and Daly City police soon determined that the woman had been slain recently, likely only hours before her discovery. The victim showed obvious signs of foul play, including trauma to her neck, indicating she had been strangled. Investigators noted that the remains bore no identification of any kind. This absence of personal items suggested she might have been living as a transient. A forensic autopsy was conducted to establish exactly how Jane Doe died and to gather clues about who she was. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of two antidepressant medications, imipramine and disapramine, in her system. These substances were not used recreationally, and the medical examiner found no evidence that she was a substance addict. Coupled with further injuries, including a cut lip and bruising on her face, authorities surmised that the overdose had been forced on her against her will. Beyond the COD, the coroner's examination provided a detailed physical description of the Jane Doe, which investigators hoped would match a missing person report. She was believed to be a white or possibly Hispanic female between 25 and 30 years old, standing around 5 feet 3 inches tall. Notably, she had extremely rough calluses on her hands, providing strong circumstantial evidence that she worked in a physical capacity. She was also generally noted to have an unkempt appearance, strongly indicating that she had fallen on hard times and lending more weight to the theory that she was a transient. Further, and perhaps most importantly, the coroner was able to determine that she had given birth at least once in her life. At the crime scene, investigators collected numerous pieces of evidence from the victim's body and the surrounding area. These items were documented in hopes they might provide leads to her identity or the circumstances of the crime. The victim was dressed in multiple layers of clothing, likely due to lack of shelter and a safe storage spot. For example, on her upper body she wore a jacket, a lavender sweatshirt with a hood, a pullover sweater, and a blue shirt. Near the body, police found a pill container bearing the name of a pharmacy located in Concord, California. The bottle's label was partially illegible, and it was empty, though investigators have strong reason to believe it was related to the act. Its presence was a puzzling clue, as Concord is a city about 40 miles away. It suggested the victim or the perpetrator likely had some connection to that area, since the prescription pills used aren't ones that had any meaningful street value. Investigators recognized a matchbook from Vern's Diner, a local restaurant in Daly City. This indicated the woman had recently visited or passed through that diner, but we'll come back to this in a moment. Fingerprint impressions were successfully lifted from the victim and submitted to law enforcement databases across the country. However, the fingerprint search received no hits, indicating that she had likely never been arrested previously. The victim's dental characteristics were recorded as well, and quick-thinking investigators were careful to preserve her DNA profile. While DNA analysis wasn't available in 1987, her DNA profile was later put into a national database, though again this yielded no results. Detectives also attempted to reconstruct the victim's last known activities. Following the clue of the Vern's Diner matchbook, detectives canvassed that area for witnesses. These inquiries produced a few promising leads. It was reported that earlier on the day of the slayings, a woman matching Jane Doe's description had been making a purchase at the restaurant. Also, when I was searching up Vern's Diner, it looks like it was a real fixture in the community for a number of years. I'm basing this on the number of Facebook posts I was able to find, saying something along the lines of, "You're not really from Daly City if you didn't go to Vern's back in the day." Around that same time, some people across the street were holding a garage sale. They recalled seeing what appeared to be the young woman in an argument with an unidentified man not far from the diner. They saw the two involved in some kind of altercation, but did not intervene, and unfortunately, they didn't know either individual. By the time police followed up, no one in the neighborhood recognized the description of the woman or could provide her name. The man seen arguing with her was never located. This was a frustrating dead end, although it strongly indicated that the victim had encountered foul play from that unknown male. It provided no names or motives. With no identification and no obvious suspect, the case faced challenges. However, the unusual nature of the crime, a combination of poisoning and strangulation, led to speculation that this might not have been an isolated incident. The method of slaying suggested a degree of planning and cruelty that could point to a serial offender. Over the years, investigators and crime analysts discussed the possibility that the perpetrator might have struck before or would strike again. A significant development in the case came over 2 decades later, in 2011. That year, authorities re-examined the evidence due to a potential link with a known serial offender. Joseph Nasso, a former resident of the Bay Area, had been arrested in April 2011 and charged with the slayings of several women. Nasso was an older man who, it turned out, had committed a string of slayings between the late 1970s to the mid-1990s, targeting women in California. His known victims had all been strangled and their bodies dumped in remote areas. When Nasso's crimes came to light, detectives in Daly City noted similarities between his modus operandi and the Jane Doe case. Both involved a female victim in roughly the same age range, barehanded strangulation, and a Northern California setting. Although the Jane Doe's death involved the additional twist of a forced overdose, the investigators felt it was plausible Nasso could have been involved. Now, personally, I think the overdose element is really what sets this case apart. But one thing we have to remember is that we don't have all the evidence that the authorities do. For open investigations, the authorities theoretically only reveal information and evidence tactically, in a way that potentially leads towards resolution. As a result of this lead, the San Mateo County Jane Doe case saw a flurry of new forensic activity in 2011. Investigators decided to perform an exhumation of Jane Doe's remains to gather additional evidence. The hope was that modern forensic techniques might reveal DNA traces of the perpetrator. Any unknown DNA profile obtained would then be compared against known offenders. The results of this effort were never announced, which isn't to say that Nasso was ruled out, but rather it's possible that no additional evidence could be found. Ultimately, we don't know if there was no DNA recovered, or if the DNA recovered simply didn't match with Joseph Nasso. So this is yet another case where I really think that genetic genealogy holds the key to giving the San Mateo Jane Doe her identity back, as well as potentially catching the perp. According to my research, there's nothing to indicate that a forensic genetic genealogy company has been retained by the San Mateo Sheriff's Office at this point. As with any case that may be solved with genetic genealogy, a big part of why cases aren't sent for this service is due to lack of public awareness of the case. Between 1975 and 1989, 7 females ranging from an 11-year-old girl to a 50-year-old woman were slain within a 20-kilometer radius in Japan's Saga Prefecture. The perpetrator, never identified, became known as the Wednesday Strangler because 6 of the 7 victims disappeared on a Wednesday. Investigators noted other common patterns across the acts. All the disappearances occurred in the evening or at night, and the 5 of the victims for whom the cause of death could be analyzed were confirmed to have died by strangulation. Further yet, most victims showed signs of indecent assault, suggesting a motive for the perp. These similarities convinced police that the incidents were connected and the work of a serial predator operating in the rural Saga region. The series of attacks began in the mid-1970s and unfolded sporadically over 14 years. The first known victim was Tomiko Yamasaki, a 12-year-old girl who vanished from her home in Kitagata on August 27th, 1975. Tomiko was home alone that evening. A friend had visited and left around 7 p.m., after which the girl mysteriously disappeared. Her mother returned that night. The television was still on, and Tomiko's shoes were by the door, but the girl was gone. She remained missing for nearly 5 years, until June 27, 1980, when her skeletal remains were discovered hidden in a septic tank by the swimming pool of a local elementary school. Only days before Tomiko's body was found, police had made another gruesome discovery at the same school. On June 24, 1980, the decomposed body of 19-year-old Ritsuko Hayakutake was found in a septic tank at that same school. Ritsuko, a young local woman, had disappeared on April 12, 1980, under similar circumstances after spending the night home alone. In the weeks after Ritsuko's disappearance, her family received a taunting letter written in an old-fashioned Japanese script. One line read that their daughter, quote, "isn't coming back," and another read, quote, "I hope you suffer." Notably, these letters were never proven to be from anyone related to the case. They also got a series of phone calls from a young-sounding man who warned them not to publicize Ritsuko's case or cooperate further with authorities. The discovery of Ritsuko's body and then Tomiko's in the exact same location 3 days later made it clear the two cases were linked. The next victim was Chizuko Ikegami, a 27-year-old factory employee from Shiroishi. On October 7, 1981, a Wednesday, Chizuko left her garment factory job and never returned home. About 2 weeks later, her body was found in a vacant lot in a nearby city. She had been strangled with an electrical power cord that was still wrapped around her neck. Just 4 months after Chizuko's slaying, an even younger victim was claimed. On February 17, 1982, Kumi Nishiyama, an 11-year-old elementary school student, was walking home when she was abducted. She had parted ways with her friends only minutes before the kidnappers struck. Kumi's body was found the next morning, stuffed inside a bag and left in a grove of trees near her school. It was estimated she was slain within 10 minutes of being taken. Several witnesses later reported seeing a suspicious middle-aged man in a white car cruising around the area that day. This man had allegedly tried to lure a woman at a bus stop into his car. This woman refused and threatened to call police. He was also seen approaching groups of school children, with some children reporting that he was offering rides, and others saying that he wanted to show them pictures. In fact, on that same afternoon, a man in a white car briefly kidnapped another young girl, releasing her only when she began crying loudly. Witnesses provided police with a partial license plate number and a description of the vehicle and driver. Unsurprisingly, the vehicle was noted to be a white sedan, very strongly suggesting the same man was responsible. Despite these leads, the man in the white car was never identified. After 1982, the perpetrator again went dormant for several years. Also, you may be wondering right now how the authorities still believe these cases are all related, but I'll be getting to that shortly. And to tip my hand more than a little bit, I'm in the camp that this was definitely carried out by multiple unrelated perpetrators, and you're about to see why. The case had grown cold when 5 years later, the violence began anew. On July 8, 1987, Sumiko Fujise, a 48-year-old restaurant worker from Takeo, left work early to go out with colleagues. After an hour together, her friends invited Sumiko to continue hanging out, but she declined and headed off on her own. Sumiko never made it home that night and was soon reported missing. About a year and a half later, on December 7, 1988, Kiyomi Nakajima, a 50-year-old housewife from Kitagata, also vanished under mysterious circumstances. Kiyomi had left her house that evening to attend a weekly volleyball practice at a local sports center less than a mile away, but she never arrived. A local resident had seen her speaking with a man on a bicycle shortly before she disappeared. 2 weeks into the search for Kiyomi, her husband received a strange phone call at home. An unidentified man claimed that Kiyomi had been found near a mountain pass. The caller hinted that he was someone the family knew, but he refused to give his name or specific details of Kiyomi's whereabouts. Kiyomi's husband recorded the strange phone message, but police were ultimately unable to trace the caller. Both Kiyomi's home and her husband's workplace began receiving repeated silent calls afterward, possibly from the same person. The final victim in this series was Tatsuyo Tatsu, a 37-year-old office worker from Kitagata. On January 25, 1989, again a Wednesday, Tatsuyo spoke with someone on the phone in the early evening, then told her mother she was going out to help a friend. She left the house and never returned. Later that same night, Tatsuyo's car was found abandoned in the parking lot of a local bowling alley. A coworker came forward to report that she had seen Tatsuyo getting into a white Toyota sedan with an unknown person that evening. This disappearance immediately set off an intensive search, but it ended in grim fashion just 2 days later, and the results would spark a massive media firestorm. On January 27, 1989, a couple driving through a wooded area in the mountains of Kitagata pulled over so the wife could gather flowers. As she walked near the base of a cliff, she stumbled upon the dead body of a woman and immediately called police. When authorities arrived and searched the area, they discovered 2 more female bodies sprawled at the bottom of the same rocky slope, about 6 feet apart from each other. Personal items and clothing belonging to the victims were found scattered in the underbrush over the area, suggesting the perp had dumped the victims and their belongings from atop the cliff. The 3 bodies were soon identified as those of Sumiko Fujise, Kiyomi Nakajima, and Tatsuyo Yoshino, the missing women from 1987 to 1989. Forensic examination determined that Kiyomi and Tatsuyo had each been strangled, while Sumiko's remains were skeletal and the cause couldn't be made out. This finding sparked a massive media sensation and also marked the end of the slayings. The discovery of 3 bodies together in January 1989 dramatically re-energized the investigation. Given that Sumiko, Kiyomi, and Tatsuyo were all dumped at the same site, police now had confirmation that a single perpetrator was behind those 3 acts. Attention quickly turned to Teruhiko Matsue, a 26-year-old man from Kitagata, who had known Tatsuyo personally. Matsue was acquainted with Tatsuyo through work and was one of the last people to call her before she disappeared. In fact, immediately after the 1989 cliffside discoveries, Matsue was briefly detained and questioned because of his link to Tatsuyo. During an intensive interrogation, he seemed to suggest his involvement. However, he quickly recanted anything that could be taken as a confession, claiming he had been coerced, and he provided an alibi. He said that he was out with friends on the night Tatsuyo was slain. At that time, with no physical evidence or eyewitness testimony implicating him, the police let him go free. For more than a decade after 1989, the Wednesday Strangler case saw little progress. It wasn't until the early 2000s that investigators revisited Teruhiko Matsue as a suspect for the 1987 to 1989 triple slayings only. By 2002, Matsue was serving a short prison sentence for an unrelated burglary conviction, when new evidence and the looming expiration of the statute of limitations prompted police to act. On June 11, 2002, Saga Prefectural Police rearrested Teruhiko Matsue in his cell and formally charged him with 3 of the serial slayings. Notably, the 15-year statute of limitations had already expired on the first 4 slayings. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, portraying Matsue as a cold-blooded serial strangler who preyed on women and dumped their bodies in the mountains. Matsui's trial opened in October 2002 in Saga District Court, and he pleaded not guilty to all charges. The case against him was largely circumstantial. The prosecution's evidence included his past alleged confession and some potential forensic traces. Matsue's defense argued that the incriminating statements he gave were coerced by an aggressive police interrogation and that the DNA evidence wasn't conclusive. In fact, when a further mitochondrial DNA test was conducted on materials from the crime scene, the results didn't link Matsue at all, which was highly problematic to the case against him. Also, I feel it necessary to mention that this sort of evidence should have been considered a good thing for the prosecution. It let them know that they didn't have their man, but perhaps because the statute of limitations had expired, they just kept up the prosecution despite obvious exculpatory evidence. Ultimately, in 2005, after significant delays, the court found the case against Matsue lacking, and all charges against him were dismissed. The court wasn't kind to how investigators handled the case, to put it mildly. The court found that he had been coerced into his pseudo-confession. Also, given the way Japanese cops handle interrogations, when a Japanese court finds that an accused was coerced, that's pretty damning. This verdict was a shocking disappointment for the police and prosecutors, who immediately appealed. The saga finally came to a close in March 2007. The Fukuoka High Court upheld the not guilty verdict on appeal, meaning he was once again cleared of all charges. In its ruling, the High Court agreed that there was no direct evidence tying Matsue to the crimes, and it criticized the investigation's sloppy methods. To date, all 7 slayings remain officially unsolved. By the time Matsue was cleared, the statute of limitations for all cases had expired. Notably, in 2010, partly spurred by cases like this, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for serious offenses, but that change was not retroactive. Even if the Wednesday Strangler was to go public today, there would be nothing to do. Over the years, the Wednesday Strangler case has prompted extensive media coverage and countless theories. Some observers have argued that multiple perpetrators could have been responsible for these 7 slayings. They point out that the victims didn't all fit one profile. 2 of the victims were just 11 and 12. 2 of the other victims were women in their very early adulthood. The last 3 victims, spanning from 1987 to 1989, on the other hand, were middle-aged women. Serial predators often prefer a specific victim type or age range, which raises the possibility that the acts were committed by at least 2 different criminals operating at different times. This theory generally suggests that 3 or more perpetrators were involved, and that most of the links are simple coincidences. That said, there are still many who believe that given all these coincidences, this was all the work of one man. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that DNA evidence was preserved from the earlier victims, and unless the perpetrator comes out and confesses, it seems unlikely we'll ever have answers. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, share this video with your friends and family. On the evening of January 29, 1988, 16-year-old Spring Miller was struck in a deliberate hit-and-run attack in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Unfortunately, she didn't make it through, and the act sounds more like something out of a horror movie than real life. Spring and her 14-year-old sister, April, were walking near their neighborhood when they approached the driveway of an apartment complex. A black and white pickup truck waited at the lot entrance, and the girls paused to let it exit. The driver motioned for them to go ahead, but as the sisters crossed in front of the truck, he suddenly accelerated and struck them. April later recounted that the driver grinned before speeding forward, running over both girls. April's legs were run over, causing injuries from which she eventually recovered, but Spring was caught under the wheels. Sadly, both the front and back tires rolled over Spring's head. Despite bystanders rushing to help, Spring Miller died shortly after the attack. Albuquerque police immediately launched an investigation. Initial findings were based largely on eyewitness accounts, since the perpetrator fled the scene. Another potential witness, a woman driving a car directly behind the truck, was seen observing the incident. April tried desperately to flag this woman down for help, but disturbingly, the female driver refused to get involved and drove away. Police appealed for this unknown witness to come forward, but she was never located. Investigators canvassed the area and collected any physical evidence available. Tire marks and debris at the scene were documented, and police theorized early on that the hit and run was intentional rather than an accident, given the manner of the attack. A police sketch of the suspect was created based on April's recollection. And yes, if you're one of those people who just listens, this is your time to look at the police sketch. Personally, I find the appearance of this perpetrator incredibly unsettling. In the initial months, leads were scarce, given the assailant had used his vehicle as the weapon and quickly fled, leaving little forensic evidence behind. Spring Miller's slaying didn't occur in isolation. In fact, it fit a disturbing pattern of hit-and-run attacks targeting women on foot in Albuquerque in 1987 and 1988. Investigators noted striking similarities between Spring's case and other unresolved incidents in the area, suggesting a single perpetrator might be responsible. In September 1987, 47-year-old Nancy Weiss, a local school teacher, was out for an early morning jog when she noticed an unfamiliar white pickup truck passing her repeatedly. Without warning, the driver struck her from behind. Weiss was knocked unconscious and later found, badly injured, at a different location. Some theorized that the attacker had moved her, possibly believing she was dead. Others theorized that due to the head injury she sustained, she may have wandered to a new location in a dissociative state before regaining full consciousness. Miraculously, Nancy Weiss survived the attack. Police later found that the truck used in the attack had been stolen, as it was later found abandoned in a nearby creek bed. Given her head injury and hazy memory of the incident, Nancy couldn't provide many further details. 2 months later, on November 11th, 1987, 38-year-old Elaine Dybel was jogging along Tramway Boulevard in Albuquerque when she was run down. Unfortunately, she didn't make it, perishing at the scene from her injuries. The attack on the Miller sisters in January 1988 sadly wouldn't be the last attack. On July 19, 1988, the pattern of attacks culminated in another incident, one that would finally give police a solid suspect. That morning, a man in a maroon sedan, later determined to be stolen, targeted 2 young women out jogging in Albuquerque. The first, Mary Beth Matthews, was confronted by a driver who tried to hit her with the car, swerving toward her and seemingly toying with her before she escaped unharmed. Just hours later, 23-year-old Monica Robles was jogging in the same area when a similar maroon car began following and harassing her. The driver repeatedly pulled ahead of Robles, turned, and drove past her multiple times. Behavior eerily reminiscent of what Nancy Weiss had described in her attack. Sensing danger, Robles tried to get away, but the driver eventually accelerated and struck her from behind, throwing her into a yard. Monica Robles survived the hit, although she was injured and traumatized. Crucially, a neighbor witnessed part of the assault and managed to take down the car's license plate number as the assailant fled the scene. Robles herself got a look at the driver and later said he watched her for some time before speeding off, apparently to see if she was going to make it or not. When police traced the license plate, they discovered the car had been reported stolen earlier that day. However, armed with the plate information and Monica's description, officers quickly located and arrested 22-year-old Christopher Martinez in connection with the attack. Martinez, who lived in Albuquerque and had a prior criminal record for burglary, was charged with multiple felonies. At last, investigators had a name and face that might match the elusive hit-and-run perpetrator. Notably, he had a habit of stealing vehicles and had stolen pickup trucks previously. These parallels immediately put Martinez at the top of the suspect list for the hit-and-run attacks. Martinez denied involvement in the previous hit-and-run attacks, and ultimately, prosecutors didn't have enough to charge him. Nonetheless, Martinez did face justice for the attack on Monica Robles and the attempted assault on Mary Beth Matthews. In November 1988, he pleaded guilty to aggravated battery and other charges related to the July attack and was given an 8-year sentence. Notably, another hit-and-run occurred in Albuquerque in September 1988, while Martinez was already behind bars. This has led some to believe that Martinez wasn't the true perpetrator, and that the actual person responsible likely stopped when he heard about Martinez. Under this theory, the actual perpetrator may have stopped the attacks when he found out the authorities believed they had their man, but didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him. Another theory suggests that all the attacks were independent and unrelated events, with the exception of the 2 July attacks, which were done by Martinez. Personally, I don't see much of a resemblance between the police sketch of Martinez and the man who attacked the Miller sisters. That said, that sketch was derived from a very brief sighting by April Miller after she had just gone through an extremely traumatic incident. The Ship of Theseus paradox dates back to ancient Greece and was first recorded by the historian Plutarch in the 1st century AD. It centers on the legendary ship that carried the hero Theseus home to Athens after he defeated the Minotaur in Crete. According to Plutarch's account, the Athenians preserved Theseus's ship as a treasured relic by gradually replacing its wooden planks as they decayed. Over time, every original piece of wood was replaced with new timber, yet the vessel was still referred to as the Ship of Theseus. This gave rise to a philosophical question that would echo through history. After all its components have been replaced one by one, is it still the same ship? Philosophers took the ship as an example of the problem of identity within change, with some arguing it remained the same ship and others insisting it was a different vessel. At its core, the Ship of Theseus poses a deceptively simple riddle. If you replace every part of an object, one after another, do you still have the original object in the end? Over the centuries, this thought experiment has been retold in various forms and has been applied to everything from George Washington's axe to numerous bands who lost all original members. A classic variant was suggested by the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who gave the puzzle an extra twist. Hobbes imagined that someone saved all the old planks as they were removed from Theseus's ship, then used those discarded parts to build a second ship. Now there are 2 ships, the continuously maintained ship made of new planks, and another ship reassembled from all the original pieces. The question becomes even trickier. Which one, if either, is the real Ship of Theseus? This variation highlights a conflict in logic. It seems impossible for both to be the same original ship without defying the basic rules of identity. The Ship of Theseus isn't just a clever puzzle. It strikes at the heart of philosophical debates about identity. One classical perspective comes from Aristotle's philosophy, using the idea of form and matter. According to Aristotle, any object can be described by its form, the design or essence of the thing, and its matter, the material it's made of. In the case of Theseus's ship, the form, its design, structure, and purpose, remained constant, even as the wooden planks were swapped out. The matter, the particular pieces of wood, changed over the years, but the overall shape and function of the vessel did not. By Aristotle's reasoning, the ship could be considered the same in identity because its formal cause, design, and purpose stayed the same. The ship still looked and functioned as Theseus's ship, fulfilling the same role, despite the new lumber. This line of thought suggests that an object's essence or pattern is what truly defines it, not the specific atoms that come and go. Other philosophers focus on the concept of continuity. They argue that identity is preserved through the continuous history or function of an object rather than its original components. For instance, those who sailed on Theseus's ship year after year could claim it's obviously the same vessel they've been aboard all along. The ship maintained an unbroken existence and use, so we naturally call it the same ship by convention. In contrast, a ship rebuilt in the museum from original planks might be seen as a replica or a restoration if the other ship sailed on, because it didn't carry forward the original ship's journey. This solution has an inherent problem, though. It creates the issue where if the replacement sails on, the original lumber ship is a replica, where if it doesn't sail on, the museum ship is the original. The ship reconstructed in a museum thus has its identity defined entirely by the function of a replacement ship. Some thinkers have concluded that the puzzle reveals a problem in our definitions, rather than in the objects themselves. They distinguish between qualitative identity, having the same properties or appearance, and numerical identity, being one and the same entity. By the end of the repairs, the ship at sea is qualitatively identical to the original. It looks and functions like the original ship, but not made of the same matter. It is not numerically identical in the strict sense of the very same object, because none of the original wood remains. In everyday life, however, we often care more about an object's continuity and qualities than its absolute material sameness. This is why calling a ship made from replacement parts is practical in everyday life, even if philosophically contentious. Modern philosophy has developed more abstract solutions as well. One radical view is compositional nihilism, which suggests that composite objects don't truly exist as single entities at all. Only their fundamental parts exist. By this view, asking if the ship is the same is a mistake, because there really is no ship, only a collection of planks arranged into the shape associated with a ship. This perspective states that only the planks, or the microscopic particles, are real, and the ship itself is just a convenient idea, essentially an illusion or a construct. At the opposite end, there are theories of four-dimensionalism, which propose that an object is not a static three-dimensional thing, but a four-dimensional entity extended in time. Under this theory, the ship is more like a long worm stretched through the fourth dimension of time. In this view, the ship of Theseus can be thought of as a series of temporal parts, a continuum of ship stages from the day it was first built to the day its last original plank was removed. All those stages together constitute the whole identity of the ship. Philosophers who favor this approach would say the ship persists as a single four-dimensional object, and each version of the ship is just a time-bound segment of that larger whole. This can be a mind-bending idea. It allows us to say the ship is and isn't the same in different senses. It's part of one continuous space-time object, yet any two time-based slices of it are not made of the same stuff, so to speak. While no consensus exists amongst philosophers, I tend to prefer this view as it appears to meaningfully resolve the paradox. That said, I know someone in the comments will say something about Wittgenstein and just totally light me up. So do your worst. I'm here for it. In the summer of 1907, Dublin Castle became the center of a mystery that still fascinates historians. The Irish crown jewels, a set of jeweled regalia belonging to the Order of St. Patrick, vanished from a secure safe within the castle walls. The theft was discovered just days before a planned royal visit, causing a scandal that shook the British administration in Ireland. On the morning of July 6, 1907, a cleaning woman arrived for her routine duties at Bedford Tower in Dublin Castle and found something amiss. The door to the strong room where the jewels safe was kept stood wide open, with a key still dangling in the lock. The inner security door was bolted, so at first nothing seemed obviously stolen. Sir Arthur Vickers, the official custodian of the jewels, was initially unconcerned and went about his day. It was only later that afternoon, when a messenger was sent to store a knight's ceremonial collar in the safe, that the grim truth was revealed. The safe had been emptied and the Irish crown jewels were gone. The alarm spread quickly. The jewels had disappeared just 4 days before King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra were due in Dublin for a state visit. A special investiture ceremony was to take place at the Irish International Exhibition, where the king planned to use the jewels to induct a new member of the Order of St. Patrick. With the regalia missing, the ceremony had to be cancelled. King Edward was reportedly furious about the theft, and the incident proved to be a major embarrassment for the Irish authorities. The Dublin Metropolitan Police launched an immediate investigation, and even a detective from London's Scotland Yard, Chief Inspector John Kane, was called in to assist. Investigators found no signs of forced entry on the doors or the safe, indicating that whoever stole the jewels had used the actual keys or precise copies. From the very start, suspicion focused on an inside job. Evidence from the crime scene reinforced the idea that the thief was someone with intimate access and patience. Inside the safe, the perpetrators had shown meticulous care. For example, a sky blue ribbon that had been attached to one of the jeweled badges was carefully unscrewed and left behind in its box. This is a task that would have taken several minutes, and the authorities speculated an outsider would have ripped it off in a hurry. Likewise, the tissue and cloth in the storage boxes were neatly refolded after the jewels were removed. This was no smash-and-grab robbery. It appeared the thief had ample time and no fear of interruption. The careful method of the theft, combined with the lack of forced entry, made it clear the culprit likely had authorized access to keys and inside knowledge of the castle's security routines. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned to those who had custody or access to the safe. The foremost figure was Sir Arthur Vickers, Ulster King of Arms, whose prestigious office included the duty of guarding the jeweled insignia. Vickers was responsible for the keys. He usually kept one of the two safe keys on his person and stored the other at his home in a locked drawer. In the wake of the theft, Vickers became one of the first suspects, simply due to his role, and a series of security lapses on his watch. It emerged that Vickers had been alarmingly lax in safeguarding the jewels. On one occasion, he had drunkenly allowed friends to handle the keys, even waking up after a party to find himself draped in the priceless jewels as a prank. Personally, I speculate that this may have been a dry run for the jewel heist, and also perhaps one of the world's first documented uses of the "it's just a prank bro" excuse. But this wasn't the only negligent thing Vickers had done. Far from it. Just weeks before the heist, he had mistakenly left the safe's key on a key ring with other office keys, which one of the servants then found and returned. Such stories cast Vickers as a negligent buffoon at best. Vickers, however, vehemently denied any involvement in the theft. He insisted he was being made a scapegoat and maintained his innocence to his dying day. Despite the lack of hard evidence tying him to the crime, Vickers faced severe consequences, and King Edward demanded his resignation. A secretive vice-regal commission later found Vickers guilty of negligence in his duties, but stopped short of finding that he was in on it. This effectively ended his career and tarnished his reputation. Another figure under scrutiny was Pierce Mahoney, an Office of Arms employee who was Vickers' nephew and assistant. Mahoney had access to the Office of Arms and was familiar with the castle's operations. He was questioned as a possible accomplice or culprit. However, most contemporaries and later historians believe Mahoney was innocent. He had no clear motive to steal the jewels and was known to be loyal to Vickers. Suspicion soon concentrated on Francis Shackleton, a charismatic man who was Vickers's second-in-command at Dublin Castle. Francis Shackleton was the younger brother of the famous Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, which gave the case an added dose of public intrigue. Unlike his explorer brother, Francis sought his fortunes in high society circles. And let's just say that Shackleton was known to get around these circles and was particularly interested in becoming very closely acquainted with wealthy and powerful men. Vickers had appointed Shackleton to the honorary position of Dublin Herald in the Office of Arms in 1905, which, while unpaid, gave him status and access to Dublin Castle. Shackleton was often a house guest of Vickers, even sharing Vickers's residence during stays in Dublin. This close relationship meant Shackleton could potentially get hold of Vickers' keys without raising suspicion. Moreover, investigators uncovered that Shackleton was in dire financial straits by 1907. He had been involved in speculative ventures that failed, and his debts were mounting, a strong possible motive for a theft of valuable jewels. All these factors made Francis Shackleton a prime suspect in the eyes of many. Indeed, Vickers himself later accused Shackleton of betrayal, and numerous people at the time believed Shackleton was the true culprit behind the heist. One theory, reported years later, suggested that Shackleton, together with his close friend Captain Richard Gorges, had capitalized on Vickers's lax security. According to this account, one night after Vickers had drunk himself into a stupor, Shackleton and Gorges supposedly lifted the keys from the sleeping Vickers. They entered the library safe, removed the jewels, then returned everything, keys and doors, to normal, so no immediate suspicion would arise. This clever ruse would mean the theft wasn't discovered until weeks later, giving the thieves a long head start. However, despite these suspicions and rumors, Francis Shackleton was never formally charged. In the official investigation, he maintained an alibi. Conveniently, he had left Ireland for London on June 11th, 1907, and did not return until after the jewels were reported missing. This alibi didn't entirely clear him for two simple reasons. It's never been entirely clear when the Irish crown jewels were actually stolen, and he may have had an accomplice such as Gorges do the deed. Some have speculated that investigators were reluctant to prosecute Shackleton for fear he might expose scandalous information about others in high society if cornered. Francis Shackleton was known to get around high society circles, and let's just say a lot of influential men may not like what he had to say about their late-night activities. Shackleton's later life did little to dispel doubts about his character. A few years after the jewel affair, he was convicted of fraud for unrelated financial crimes in 1913 and spent time in prison. He had even fled the UK to Portuguese East Africa for a time, where he attempted to work in the colonial administration and later found work on a plantation. Upon release, he changed his name and lived quietly abroad, dying in obscurity many years later, having never admitted any role in the Dublin Castle heist. A final suspect emerged long after the initial investigation: Francis Bennett Goldney. Goldney was an Englishman who had been appointed to a minor post at Dublin Castle just months before the jewels vanished. At the time of the theft, Goldney attracted little suspicion as he was seen as a wealthy, respectable gentleman with no obvious motive. And yes, you heard me correctly, he wasn't investigated because he was already seen as rich enough, as if being wealthy had ever stopped someone from accumulating more wealth. It was only in 1918, when Goldney died in a car accident in France, that his reputation darkened. After his death, authorities discovered a trove of stolen historical items hidden in his home, revealing that Goldney had been secretly stealing valuable artifacts. This shocking discovery led some to retroactively suspect Goldney in the Irish crown jewels case. If he was willing to steal manuscripts and artworks, perhaps he also stole the jewels. Investigators never found any direct evidence linking Goldney to the 1907 heist, but his later infamy as a thief added another tantalizing theory to the saga. Notably, some have suggested that there was a curse on the Irish crown jewels. Vickers was executed in 1921 during the Irish War of Independence on suspicion that he was a British sympathizer. Francis Shackleton's life spiraled down after 1907. By 1910, he was bankrupt, and in the years that followed, he was convicted for multiple fraudulent schemes, including swindling a longtime friend out of a fortune. Despite being from a wealthy and famous family, he died in relative poverty, living under an assumed name. Captain Richard Gorges, who had been whispered about as Shackleton's accomplice, likewise led a troubled life. He was involved in a violent incident with the police in which he ended up slaying an officer. Due to some complicating circumstances, he was only sentenced to 12 years in prison. While in prison, Gorges allegedly tried to bargain for leniency by offering information about the crown jewels, but authorities did not deem his claims credible. Gorges was later prosecuted for minor offenses, including shoplifting and passing bad checks. In 1944, he was struck by a train in London, ending the tale of Captain Richard Gorges once and for all. Potentially for reasons of propriety and saving face for a wealthy family of the landed gentry, his death seems to have been ruled accidental, but you can apply your own judgment. Pierce Mahoney, Vickers' loyal assistant, withdrew from public life in 1914. He was found dead by an accidental shot in a boating incident, a mysterious end that some have wondered about. As for Francis Bennett Goldney, he continued a respectable public career, even becoming a member of Parliament, until his car accident in 1918. Despite intensive investigations and worldwide attention, the Irish crown jewels have never been recovered. Notably, the jewels weren't inherently incredibly valuable at the time. It was their status as the Irish crown jewels and the historical value of the jewels that made them just so priceless. Modern theorists speculate that for this reason, it's unlikely that the goods were broken up, anonymized, and sold separately. On a frigid winter day in January 1996, 13-year-old Rachel Mellon Skemp was homesick from school in Bolingbrook, a suburb of Chicago. She spent the day with her stepfather, Vince Mellon, who was the only other person in the house. According to Vince's account, Rachel went to her bedroom to take a nap in the afternoon, and he left the house for about half an hour to walk the family dog. He said the front door was left unlocked, and that when he returned, he didn't immediately check on Rachel. It was only later that he realized the 13-year-old was missing. Rachel's absence ultimately came to light when her mother, Amy, arrived home from work that evening and went to tell Rachel that dinner was ready. To her shock, Rachel was gone. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle in the house, and all of Rachel's winter clothes and personal essentials, her coat, shoes, and purse, were still inside her room. Given the bitter cold weather that day, these abandoned belongings were an immediate red flag. The only things missing from the home were the blue blanket and 2 pillows from Rachel's bed. Family members and neighbors frantically searched the neighborhood and nearby park that night, but no trace of Rachel could be found. From the outset, investigators treated Rachel's disappearance as a likely crime rather than a runaway case. Police quickly focused on Rachel's stepfather, since he had been the last person to see her alive, and his account was the only narrative of events. Vince Mellon was brought in for questioning multiple times, and even took a lie detector test. According to police, he failed key portions of the polygraph exam. Meanwhile, authorities combed the area with search teams, dogs, and helicopters, but turned up no physical evidence pointing to Rachel's whereabouts. For Rachel's family and the community, the lack of answers was agonizing, and the case began to grow cold as weeks and months passed. A potential breakthrough came when police discovered Rachel's diary during a search of the home. In one extremely troubling journal entry from the summer before her disappearance, Rachel described how her stepfather had committed horrific acts against her. This revelation added a dark layer to the investigation, suggesting a possible motive for foul play. Acting on growing suspicions, a grand jury was convened in 2000, 4 years after Rachel went missing, to hear evidence in the case. Vince Mellon and Rachel's mother were subpoenaed to testify, and investigators obtained samples of Vince's blood, hair, and saliva as part of the probe. Despite these efforts, the grand jury ended without any indictments, and no one has ever been charged in connection with Rachel's disappearance. The case remained frustratingly stalled with circumstantial evidence pointing toward a crime, but no body or definitive proof to allow prosecutors to move forward. A consensus emerged among investigators. The most plausible explanation is that Rachel met with foul play inside her own home. The circumstances overwhelmingly suggested an inside job, and police have long considered Vince Mellon the prime suspect. He was the only adult present, and his timeline of events left a suspicious gap when Rachel could have been harmed. Further, the disturbing diary entry about Vince's inappropriate behavior towards Rachel only reinforced this theory in the eyes of law enforcement. Vince Mellon also had a documented history of violence, having previously had a restraining order put on him for pushing Rachel's mother down a flight of stairs. Disturbingly, despite all the circumstantial evidence, Rachel's mother chose to stand by her husband. Though to redeem your faith in humanity, at least somewhat, her father, Jeff Skemp, has been tireless in his efforts to get justice for his daughter for almost 30 years now. Rachel's case is one of those cases where I feel that the key to resolving the crime is significant sustained attention on her case. Unfortunately, Rachel's case doesn't appear to have attracted significant national media attention at the time. A summer night in Glacier National Park in Montana would transform into a horrific event, now known to history as the Night of the Grizzlies. The reason why this deeply disturbing set of events happened on a single night has been the subject of debate and scientific inquiry for over half a century. On the evening of August 12, 1967, Julie Helgeson and her boyfriend Roy Ducat hiked to Glacier's Granite Park Chalet, an isolated backcountry lodge. They set up camp roughly a quarter-mile away from the chalet. The summer season had drawn many visitors to the area, and bears were known to roam near the chalet's garbage dump. The couple, both seasonal employees at a park lodge, slept under the stars in their sleeping bags. Shortly after midnight, a grizzly bear wandered into their campsite. Helgeson spotted the bear and urgently whispered to Ducat to play dead, hoping the animal would pass by. The bear, however, attacked the pair, knocking them out of their sleeping bags and mauling both. It then focused its rage on Helgeson, biting her severely and dragging her roughly 100 yards away into the darkness. Ducat, despite a badly injured arm, managed to run toward the chalet to seek help as Helgeson screamed for assistance. Other campers and chalet guests formed a search party, but fear and confusion delayed their pursuit of the bear. Nearly 2 hours passed before a rescue group felt it was safe enough to follow the blood trail and search for Helgeson. By the time she was found, Helgeson was gravely wounded. Rescuers brought her back to the chalet and did what they could to treat her injuries, but she succumbed to her wounds in the early morning hours. Roy Ducat would survive the ordeal, despite sustaining quite severe injuries in the mauling. In a separate incident only a few hours later on the morning of August 13th, another grisly attack unfolded about 6 miles away at a backcountry campsite by Trout Lake. Michelle Coons, also 19 and a summer employee at the park, had ventured to Trout Lake on August 12th with 4 friends, all of them co-workers from the Lake McDonald Lodge. They camped in an area that, unbeknownst to them, was the territory of a rather scrappy old grizzly bear. In fact, rangers later noted this animal habitually scavenged at a nearby dump site known as Kelly's Camp. This particular bear had a reputation for odd and aggressive behavior, and it had even chased a group of Girl Scouts just a week earlier. As the 5 young campers slept along Trout Lake, the grizzly entered their campsite. One woman awoke to the bear sniffing her sleeping bag, but she held still, and the bear moved on. When the animal began nosing Michelle Coons, Michelle woke and screamed in alarm. The sudden scream provoked the bear to attack. Michelle tried to escape, but the zipper on her sleeping bag jammed, trapping her inside. While Michelle struggled, her companions managed to scramble up nearby trees in an attempt to save themselves. Now, just as a quick bear safety public service announcement, you don't climb up a tree to avoid a bear. The bear mauled Michelle, dragged her roughly 300 feet into the woods, and disappeared into the night. Terrified, her friends remained in the trees for hours until daybreak. At dawn, they climbed down and hiked until they could find a park ranger station, where they breathlessly reported the attack. A search party later found Michelle's lifeless body. Park officials mobilized quickly once the attacks were reported. Although the 2 incidents turned out to be unrelated, 2 different bears were responsible. The fact that they occurred on the same night raised immediate alarm. Rangers and wildlife staff were dispatched to locate and eliminate any dangerous bears near the attack sites to prevent further harm. Glacier National Park's management gave orders to shoot any bear found in the vicinity of Trout Lake or Granite Park Chalet following the attacks. Over the next 2 days, rangers shot several grizzly bears suspected of involvement. By Monday, August 14th, a total of 4 grizzlies had been eliminated as part of the investigation. 2 of those bears were habituated to eating garbage around the Granite Park Chalet and were shot the day after Helgeson's attack. Another was slain near Trout Lake. An examination of its stomach contents revealed human hair and tissue, conclusively identifying it as the bear that had attacked Michelle Coons. This bear was notably emaciated, and even had bits of glass embedded in its gums, suggesting it had been desperately scavenging on trash. The final bear was a female with 2 cubs that was found back at the Granite Park area. Blood on her claws indicated she was likely the one that mauled Helgeson, though this wasn't confirmed with absolute certainty, as she may have come by after the initial assault. In the immediate aftermath, Glacier's rangers and even Federal Bureau of Investigation agents carefully documented the incidents. They collected evidence, such as bear hair and plaster casts of tracks, and performed necropsies on the culled bears to understand exactly what happened. The shocking nature of the 2 attacks prompted intense scrutiny. Park officials and biologists worked together to piece together the timeline of events and determine what factors had caused normally reclusive grizzlies to attack humans so savagely. It soon became clear that both incidents were the result of unusual circumstances that had been building for some time. As the investigation continued in the weeks and months after August 1967, the park also examined its own practices and history with bears. Rangers noted that just a few days before the attacks, they had filed reports warning that grizzlies were routinely feeding on garbage behind the Granite Park Chalet and around nearby campsites. In fact, allowing bears to scavenge on trash was a long-standing unofficial practice at some park facilities. The chalet's caretakers knew that having bears around was a popular tourist attraction and essentially just let more and more bears accumulate in the area. A trash incinerator installed in 1966 was too small to handle all the chalet's waste, so garbage was often dumped in a gully nearby, luring bears on a nightly basis. Word spread of this practice, and people went to the chalet with the sole purpose of seeing the bears attempt to gorge themselves on trash. At Trout Lake, investigators found the campsite littered with food waste. Indeed, in the weeks after Michelle's death, rangers removed nearly 20 bags of food garbage from the Trout Lake site. Glacier National Park had unknowingly set the stage for tragedy by allowing improper waste disposal and food habits to draw bears and people dangerously close together. In trying to understand how two fatal bear attacks could occur in one night, park officials and experts considered several major theories. One widely accepted explanation is that the bears had become food conditioned due to human negligence. In the mid-20th century, it was common in national parks for bears to feed on garbage left by visitors or at park dumps. At Glacier, the Granite Park Chalet had been effectively feeding bears its table scraps all summer, and the Trout Lake campground was full of litter. This habituation to human food caused the bears to lose their natural fear of people. Conversely, the human visitors started to lose their fear of bears as well, and felt more comfortable having them in proximity to campsites and cabins. The theory holds that by 1967, years of improper garbage management had taught some glacier grizzlies to treat humans and campsites as food sources, directly leading to the attacks. Interestingly, one theory suggests that the grizzlies had believed that the humans in their sleeping bags were actually the equivalent of the bags of food waste they would routinely tear open. While this is nearly universally accepted as one of the reasons for the attacks, this doesn't answer why these two attacks occurred on the very same night. On the night of August 12th, a lightning storm rolled through parts of Glacier Park. Some contemporary observers speculated that the thunder, lightning, and atmospheric electricity may have agitated the bears, making them more aggressive or unpredictable. Thunderstorms are known to affect animal behavior, and it was noted that the night's lightning was particularly intense. However, this theory remains largely speculative. While the storm was a noteworthy detail of that night, there is no direct evidence that it triggered the attacks. Park officials at the time could not conclusively link the lightning to the bears' actions, but it was considered as a possible contributing factor. Initially, many people viewed the two attacks as a freakishly rare coincidence, essentially a one-in-a-million event. In the 57 years that Glacier had been a national park, there hadn't been one single fatal event between a human and a grizzly bear. Statisticians noted that based on Glacier's record, the odds of even a single fatal mauling were extremely low, and the odds of two separate attacks on the same night were astronomically small. This led to the early belief that the night of the grizzlies was a fluke occurrence, a perfect storm of bad luck. However, many of the rangers believed that given the increasing conflict between grizzlies and humans over the course of the summer of '67, a fatal attack was imminent. They also noted that many more people than usual had been coming to Glacier that summer solely because grizzlies had become so common. Under this theory, all the data from previous years can't be meaningfully taken into account when conducting a statistical analysis. Every night over the summer of 1967 could have had a relatively significant chance of a grizzly mauling event. This is supported by the fact that there were close calls previously throughout the summer. Another theory, which was popular at the time, suggested that female bears were naturally aggressive towards women entering their territory. A bear's sense of smell is estimated to be about 2,000 times better than a human's sense of smell. Notably, their smell is about 10 times stronger than a bloodhound's in terms of detecting scents, and grizzlies can pick up smells from up to 20 miles away. Under this theory, female bears mistook women entering into their territory as some sort of female competitor or threat and eliminated them. This theory was later disproven, but it remains a popular urban myth to this day. Other more fringe theories suggest that the local wildlife essentially struck back against human encroachment into their traditional lands and territories. Ultimately, in practice, the night of the grizzlies did end up leading to increased respect for the natural lifestyles of the animals that inhabit national parks. While it's still not clear why two grizzly attacks occurred on the same night, the consensus now leans towards severe park mismanagement and tragic coincidence. In 1985, Charlie Sigmund married Ann Mitchum, who had two young sons from a previous marriage, and embraced her children as his own. Within a year, however, troubling signs emerged in their marriage. Charlie grew suspicious that Anne was having an affair and dabbling in the occult. In mid-1986, he reportedly found strange objects and books in their home, including a doll stuck with a needle that Anne said was for satanic rituals. On another night, Charlie caught Anne conducting what he believed was a satanic ritual in their shed, where she was surrounded by lit candles and chanting before a horned goat's image. Deeply disturbed, Charlie confronted Anne and asked her to leave. Anne moved out with her children and went to live with Gary Goff, a 43-year-old former police officer who, perhaps not coincidentally, was an old friend of Charlie's. Still, Charlie remained protective of Anne's boys. When Anne phoned on October 19, 1986, claiming the children were crying for him, Charlie immediately rushed to Goff's house to check on them and make sure they were okay. What happened next remains highly contentious, but what is known for sure is that Charlie was slain. In the early hours of October 20th, Anne burst into the Caruthersville, Missouri police station to report that her estranged husband, Charlie, had been slain at her boyfriend's home. Officers arrived to find Charlie's body with multiple wounds amid signs of a violent struggle. Anne and her boyfriend, Gary Goff, claimed Charlie had broken in and attacked Anne, forcing Goff to fire at him in self-defense. Investigators weren't entirely convinced by the self-defense story. With no hard evidence to contradict Anne and Goff's account, police initially released them. But days later, an informant came forward saying Anne had talked about wanting Charlie dead. Police had this friend wear a wire, and Anne was recorded making incriminating statements about needing to leave town. That was enough for a warrant, but Anne and Gary had already vanished, abandoning Anne's two young children. A nationwide manhunt followed. Weeks later, Goff's truck was found abandoned in Arizona, but there was no sign of the fugitives. In May 1989, Gary Goff resurfaced and surrendered to police in Missouri. He claimed they had split up while on the run, and that Anne had been granted powers by Satan and even threatened to curse him if he turned himself in. And yeah, it was the 1980s, so throwing in some devil worship was par for the course. Also, I realized that I had a typo in my script saying par for the curse instead of par for the course, but I decided to go with it given the context. Goff eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree slaying in Charlie's death and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Meanwhile, Anne Sigmund remained a fugitive. Authorities suspected she might be living under aliases like Andy Hayes or Andy Partlow in states like Oregon or Arizona, but every lead went cold and she's never been found. Notably, some have theorized that Gary Goff may have also eliminated Anne Sigmund, perhaps out of fears for her occult abilities. Alternatively, it's been suggested that he may have knocked her off because she was potentially in the position to strike a plea deal. Gary Goff was a former cop and definitely knew that if they were caught together, Anne would be a liability rather than an asset. Personally, given his law enforcement background, and given that he had already shown a capacity for extreme violence, this is the theory I tend to prefer. As for why Anne likely set up Charlie to be taken out, that also remains a mystery. While some believe that she wanted Charlie out of the picture for the purposes of a life insurance payout, this was never proven. Another theory is strongly rooted in the satanic panic that had gripped America during the 1980s. Under this theory, she lured Charlie over for the purposes of making a sacrifice to the devil. However, this remains highly speculative and also highly sensationalistic. If she's still alive, she would now be in her 80s, though of course there are reasons to doubt this. As for Gary Goff, he was sentenced for his involvement in Charlie's slaying and was released from prison in 2002. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, share this video on your socials and with your friends and family. Sharing my videos helps me spend way more time working on quality content to bring to you. Ball lightning is the name given to rare, glowing spheres that sometimes accompany thunderstorms, baffling, fascinating, and sometimes ending those who witness them. One of the most dramatic early accounts comes from 1638 in rural England. On an autumn Sunday, worshippers packed the village church of Widecombe in the Moor in Devon, England, when a fierce thunderstorm struck. Without warning, an object described as a great ball of fire tore through a window of the church. The glowing sphere hurtled inside, bouncing wildly among the congregation. Panicked cries echoed as the fiery orb ripped part of the roof open and sent heavy oak beams crashing down. Witnesses described how it flashed and exploded with a thunderous noise, ending 4 people and injuring dozens more in the chaos. Some were found with strange burns on their skin, but curiously, their clothing was unscathed. To the 17th century villagers, it was a terrifying supernatural event, with some viewing it as some sort of judgment from God, while others viewed it as the work of Satan. Today, scientists believe this was an early record of ball lightning, one of the first detailed descriptions of its deadly power. Another early example comes about 5 centuries before, though the account isn't quite as dramatic. In 1295, an English monk recorded that a marvelous ball descended near London. He described a bright white sphere, which spun down into the River Thames. Centuries before electricity was understood, this medieval chronicler noted the orb's strange behavior with awe. In August 1753, science itself became a victim of ball lightning. On a stormy day in St. Petersburg, Russia, Professor Georg Richman rushed out with an iron rod and kite, attempting to replicate Benjamin Franklin's lightning experiment. As Richman and his colleagues stood by, a luminous ball formed on the kite's string. The fiery orb raced down the wet string, struck Richman's forehead, and essentially blew him up on the spot. The blast was so intense that it blew his shoes apart and left his clothing charred. Richman's tragic demise, the first recorded scientist to fall victim to this phenomenon, underscored how dangerously real ball lightning could be. By the 1800s, ball lightning had become a staple of early science, with solving this mystery becoming a major fascination of many scientists. Ball lightning isn't just confined to old historical records, and until the 20th century, many scientists remained highly skeptical that it was even a real phenomenon due to its rarity. In fact, the 20th century brought some of the most astonishing eyewitness reports, convincing many skeptics that ball lightning is very real. One famous incident occurred in 1963 aboard an Eastern Airlines flight flying through a thunderstorm. Shortly after a regular lightning flash struck the plane, a glowing sphere the size of a basketball emerged in the passenger cabin. Stunned passengers watched as this silent ball of light drifted down the aisle of the airliner, maintaining a steady height and course. A physicist on board later described how the orb glided past rows of seats before disappearing. It gave off no heat and didn't scorch anything, yet it was clearly visible as a free-floating ball of light inside a metal airplane. Equally startling are reports from ordinary homes. In one ball lightning encounter from the 1970s, a woman in England was sitting in her living room during a storm when a grapefruit-sized ball came straight through her closed window. The glowing orb floated at shoulder height for about 10 seconds, wobbling slightly, and then vanished with a sudden loud bang. Over the years, scientists have proposed a range of ideas to make sense of these glowing orbs. One leading hypothesis today is essentially chemical. When a regular lightning bolt strikes the ground, it might vaporize certain minerals in the soil into a hot charged gas. This cloud of vaporized minerals could coalesce into a glowing plasma ball that floats above the ground. gradually cooling and shining for a few seconds. In 2012, researchers in China captured a ball lightning event on high-speed cameras, and the light spectrum revealed vaporized elements like silicon, iron, and calcium in the orb. The chemical spark hypothesis fits many reports, especially those where ball lightning is seen right after a lightning bolt hits soil or sand. As the glowing globule burns off those elements in air, it would shine like a hot ember until it fades or explodes. This model neatly explains why some ball lightning lives only a moment and often appears after a lightning impact on the ground. Another popular theory envisions ball lightning as a kind of electromagnetic bubble. In this scenario, the lightning bolt that precedes the orb isn't just delivering electricity to the ground, it's also pumping out a burst of microwave radiation. Some scientists suggest that if those microwaves become trapped in a spherical pocket of ionized air, they could sustain a glowing ball of electricity. The microwaves bouncing inside keep ionizing the air, so the sphere stays lit for a while, even after the initial lightning bolt is gone. Not all explanations are so straightforward. Some researchers have ventured into more exotic territory. A few have wondered if ball lightning might be triggered by subatomic reactions, or even antimatter. Others noted the odd psychological effects of lightning strikes and proposed that ball lightning could be an optical illusion or a hallucination induced in our brains by magnetic fields. Could it be that people only think they see a floating ball when it's really a trick of the mind after a close lightning flash? Most scientists are skeptical of the hallucination idea, especially since ball lightning has been seen by multiple people at once, and photographed and recorded. However, proponents of the hallucination theory argue that this is just one of many explanations for ball lightning, and not the sole cause. People from outside the scientific community have also suggested paranormal explanations for ball lightning. For instance, some have proposed that ball lightning is a physical manifestation of spiritual energy. Others have proposed that it's a supernatural entity, or ghost light type phenomenon. These ideas remain quite popular because science simply doesn't have any firm answers the further you go down the ball lightning rabbit hole. At any rate, these are just a few of the dozens upon dozens of theories that have been put forth over the last centuries. Personally, this topic has been a major fascination of mine since I saw what I believed to be ball lightning hovering over a lake. That said, I was camping and had just woken up and went to bed right after, so perhaps the whole thing was a dream. Adan Manzano, a 27-year-old sports anchor and reporter for Telemundo Kansas City, was found dead in his hotel room in Kenner, Louisiana, on February 5th, 2025. He was in the New Orleans area to cover Super Bowl 59, as his hometown Kansas City Chiefs were set to play in the championship. Manzano's sudden death during Super Bowl week shocked colleagues and viewers. There were no immediate signs of trauma on his body, and authorities awaited further tests to determine the cause of death. The tragedy was also personal. About a year before his death, Manzano had lost his wife in a car accident and was left raising their young daughter as a single father. Manzano failed to show up for a scheduled work meeting on February 5th, prompting hotel staff to check his room. He was found unresponsive and later pronounced dead. Given the timing and the fact that he was believed to be in good health, police immediately treated the death as suspicious. Investigators noticed that some of Manzano's personal belongings, including his cell phone and credit card, were missing from the hotel room. Security footage provided a crucial lead. Around 5 a.m., on the day of his death, Manzano was seen on hotel surveillance cameras entering his room with an unknown woman. About an hour later, that woman left the room alone, and Manzano never emerged again. This discovery launched a full-scale investigation as detectives worked to identify the woman in the video and determine what transpired during that early morning hour. Police quickly identified the woman from the footage as 48-year-old Danette Colbert, a resident of nearby Slidell, Louisiana. Evidence against Colbert mounted rapidly. Investigators tracked the use of Manzano's stolen credit card and found that it had been used at a New Orleans gas station and multiple stores shortly after his death. Both the missing phone and credit card were later recovered at Colbert's residence, further tying her to the incident. Within days, Colbert was located and arrested on fraud and theft charges for allegedly stealing and using Manzano's credit cards. At the time of her arrest, authorities had not yet charged her with crimes directly related to Manzano's death, but she was considered a person of interest as the investigation continued. Colbert's arrest was accompanied by disturbing revelations about her past, but I'll get back to that in a moment. Due to the circumstances, a judge ordered Colbert held without bond, deeming her a flight risk and potential danger to the public based on her criminal history. A significant breakthrough in the case came when preliminary toxicology results were disclosed later in February. During a court hearing, a detective testified that Manzano's system tested positive for a powerful prescription sedative with a high potential to be misused. Investigators noted that Manzano did not have a prescription for this or any similar substance. Authorities noted that this detail was crucial, as benzos are often used in crimes to incapacitate victims before robbing them. As the investigation progressed, Colbert's background came under intense scrutiny. It turned out that this wasn't the first time she had been implicated in crimes involving dosing and robbing unsuspecting victims. Law enforcement officials revealed that she's a career criminal with a long rap sheet across multiple jurisdictions. She had been first arrested in New Orleans as far back as 2012, and over the years had faced charges for robbery, fraud, and even battery, often pleading guilty and receiving probation. Notably, in 2022, Colbert was arrested twice in Las Vegas on felony charges of grand larceny and administering substances to commit a felony. In those Vegas cases, she was accused of meeting men in hotels, dosing them until they passed out, and then stealing valuables. Notably, both Nevada cases were later dismissed when the victims declined to testify, perhaps for fear of what happened in Vegas not staying in Vegas, but the pattern was clear. Colbert returned to New Orleans thereafter and continued to rack up arrests on theft and fraud charges. Police in New Orleans were well aware of her modus operandi. The police chief noted that Colbert was known to prowl the French Quarter looking for potential marks amongst the crowd. Based on the evidence and Colbert's background, the leading theory at present is that Manzano's death wasn't intentionally caused, at least in the most strict definition of the word intentional. Rather, the authorities believe it was the result of a disturbing scheme to administer substances to Manzano and rob him, hoping that he would be too embarrassed to go to the authorities. Her reckless dosing of the unsuspecting Manzano is believed but not yet confirmed to be the reason for Manzano's death. The authorities are now looking into the possibility that other individuals were affected by Colbert's disturbing theft strategy. Authorities allege that she has operated in both New Orleans and Las Vegas, and there's the potential that further victims may come forth, or may be uncovered in the future. In late September 1944, the quiet town of Mattoon, Illinois was seized by an unusual panic. Residents began waking in the dead of night to a sickening, sweet odor filling their homes, followed by alarming symptoms including nausea, weakness, and even temporary paralysis. Several victims claimed to glimpse a shadowy figure fleeing into the darkness, leading to rumors that a mysterious prowler was creeping up to houses and spraying gas through open windows. Before long, this supposed phantom attacker earned an ominous nickname, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. The scare began to grip the town on the night of September 1st, 1944. Aline Kearney was at home with her young daughter and sister when she noticed an overpowering, sweet odor in her bedroom. Moments later, Aline experienced partial paralysis of her legs and a burning sensation in her throat, rendering her unable to move or call for help. After a couple minutes, she was finally able to yelp for help. Her sister rushed in and caught the strange smell as well, discovering it seemed to be coming through the open window. That same night, Aline's husband returned home and spotted a tall, thin man dressed in dark clothes and wearing a tight-fitting mask lurking outside their window. The stranger fled into the darkness as soon as he was seen. Aline's frightening symptoms subsided after about 30 minutes, but the mysterious gas attack had set the stage for further terror. The next morning, a local paper broke the story with a bold headline declaring that a quote-unquote anesthetic prowler was on the loose in Mattoon. News of the bizarre incident spread quickly, and soon other residents came forward with similar tales. A nearby couple reported that they had been awakened by a strange sweet odor the night before the Kearney incident, after which both became sick and partially paralyzed for over an hour. Another woman claimed she may have had a comparable attack much earlier in the summer, suggesting the gasser might have tested out his method of attack even earlier. On the same night as the Kearney case, another woman was up late when she heard a faint sound outside, and then smelled an odd odor that made her legs and hands go numb. Yet another report described an unnamed mother whose children began vomiting after a sweet smell filled their home. Within days, multiple households around Mattoon recounted these eerie encounters, creating a timeline of terror that spanned the first 2 weeks of September 1944. As the reports multiplied, a pattern emerged. Most victims were women who had been at home at night, and many described the gas's scent as sweet or perfumed. Symptoms consistently included nausea, throat irritation, and temporary paralysis or weakness in the limbs. By September 5th, a particularly chilling piece of physical evidence turned up. A resident named Beulah Cords found a mysterious damp white cloth on her front porch and picked it up out of curiosity. I believe there's a saying about cats and curiosity that applies to situations like this, especially when there's rumors of a madman on the loose. The cloth emitted a noxious odor that immediately sickened her. She felt as if she'd received an electric shock. Her face swelled, and her throat burned. Beulah was violently ill for hours afterward, and she later speculated that the rag had been left to knock out her dog so the prowler could approach the house unnoticed. Alongside the cloth, police recovered a key and an empty tube of lipstick on the sidewalk near the porch. These strange items suggested to the authorities that an intruder might have been attempting to enter homes. Over the next several days, Mattoon's crisis only intensified. On September 6th, no fewer than half a dozen new incidents were logged around town. Entire families fell ill from mysterious fumes, and one man caught a fleeting glimpse of a tall, thin figure sprinting away from his property, which he believed was the gasser escaping. The following nights brought more significant alarm. In one home, 2 sisters experienced 3 repeat gas attacks and even described seeing a thin blue vapor as well as machinery outside their window. By September 10th, the tally of reported victims had risen into the dozens. One local paper noted 33 people had smelled the gas over 12 days. Mattoon was in a frenzy, and the elusive anesthetic prowler seemed to vanish into the shadows each time, without leaving solid proof of his identity. The growing desperation in the town was palpable as people wondered who would be hit next. Authorities responded to the escalating panic with urgency. Mattoon City Police increased nighttime patrols and even enlisted help from state and federal officers, including the FBI, to hunt for the so-called Mad Gasser. Armed citizens formed vigilante groups to guard neighborhoods after dark, determined to protect their families from the phantom assailant. Roadblocks were set up and volunteers kept watch on porches, yet despite the heightened alert, no one was ever caught in the act. Investigators looked for any tangible evidence that could crack the case. They examined the mysterious cloth from Beulah Cord's porch in a laboratory, hoping to identify a chemical or poison, but tests revealed nothing. Police also noted other odd clues reported by citizens, such as footprints found beneath windows and cuts in window screen mesh, but none of these led to a concrete suspect. The authorities compiled a list of unusual individuals and local characters who might fit the phantom anesthetist profile, and speculation ran rampant. However, despite following up on numerous leads, the authorities never could find any perpetrator or perpetrators behind the attacks, if any attacks did indeed take place. In the aftermath of the incident, three main theories emerged to explain the Mad Gasser mystery. The explanation that gained the most acceptance was that the events were a classic case of mass hysteria. Sociologists and psychologists frequently cite the events in Mattoon as a textbook example of mass hysteria and collective panic. According to this theory, the rash of reports was driven by anxiety. World War II was at its height, and many local men were overseas, facing constant threats. The ones who stayed behind were largely working long hours in local factories. Further, Allied countries had been advised by their governments to be wary of Axis agents in their midst. The people of Mattoon were under significant stress, and once the idea of a gas maniac took hold, every unusual odor or faint symptom triggered real fear reactions. Neighbors exchanged stories that amplified the panic, and sensational newspaper headlines fueled the fire further. In short, under this theory, the community unwittingly manifested a phantom out of collective stress and suggestion. This mass hysteria explanation accounts for why no confirmed physical evidence was ever found to conclusively identify a gas or an attacker. Further, it also explains why the reports stopped as soon as authority figures challenged the reality of the attacks. However, not everyone is convinced that hysteria alone explains Mattoon's strange two-week terror. Some residents and researchers believe there may indeed have been a real attacker lurking that September. After all, a number of witnesses were adamant that they saw a tall, sinister figure wearing dark clothing prowling around their properties at night. The Kearney's sighting became the template for the Mad Gasser's image, but interestingly, one later witness described the prowler as possibly a woman disguised in men's clothing. Some have speculated that a woman could have been overlooked by authorities because investigators simply couldn't accept that the criminal wasn't a man. Another variant of the real assailant theory suggests that an Axis agent or an Axis sympathizer may have actually been active in Mattoon. Under this theory, this agent may have picked Mattoon since it was located in the soft underbelly of America. Conducting such an attack in such a place may have been, in essence, a last-ditch psychological operation by Axis agents to demoralize the American people. Further, some have theorized that evidence of the reality of the attacks was found once the FBI was called in, but that the true nature of the attacks was covered up for reasons of national security. Personally, I think that this theory may have carried some weight in 1944, but given that we're now over 80 years on, I suspect this would have been declassified. Another prominent explanation at the time was industrial pollution, or an industrial accident. Notably, the police chief suggested that any number of the nearby factories may have released any number of toxic chemicals which could have had similar effects. Despite the competing theories, the general consensus at present is that the Mad Gasser was very likely a mass hysteria event. That said, the Mad Gasser being a collective delusion doesn't really solve the mystery of why this event happened localized in Mattoon at the time it did. The pressures faced by the town were largely the same as any other small town across America during the war, so what confluence of factors made Mattoon special? Hey everyone, Jimmy here once again reminding you to subscribe and share if you haven't done so already. Now let's get back to business. On January 27, 1993, two young girls made a grim find along a wooded roadside in Wayne Fitzgerald State Park near the town of Ina, Illinois. They had stumbled upon a woman's head, with no sign of the rest of her body in the area. Investigators noted she had extensive dental work and had signs of having worn braces in the past, clues that strongly hinted that she had been well cared for in her youth. Due to the location of the discovery, the unknown woman became known as the Ina Jane Doe, a name that would stand in for her identity for nearly 3 decades. From the start, authorities treated the case as a slaying, and the removal of her head was presumed to be an attempt to hinder identification. Despite forensic examination, the victim's identity remained elusive, and the trail of leads quickly grew cold. Forensic experts carefully examined the remains and estimated her age to be between 30 and 50 years old, a significant miscalculation that may have prevented her identification. An examination of the skull and upper vertebrae suggested a distinctive medical condition, which might have caused her head to tilt to one side during her life. This led police to believe the woman's posture or facial features could have appeared asymmetrical. Early on, a sketch and a clay facial reconstruction were created to portray the victim with the suspected leftward head tilt and facial asymmetry. Notably, these attempts were intended to exaggerate the asymmetry to make her most distinct feature more noticeable. While this has worked well on a number of other cases, unfortunately, as you'll see shortly, Ina Jane Doe's face wasn't just not asymmetrical, her face was very symmetrical, and her neck was fine. These highly distinctive images, along with details of her dental work, were distributed in hopes of finding a match among missing persons. Unfortunately, no results were returned, and months passed into years without any new information. Unbeknownst to Illinois authorities at the time, a parallel mystery was unfolding 175 miles away in Clarksville, Tennessee. On Christmas Eve of 1992, just 1 month before the head was found, 25-year-old Susan Lund, a local mother of 3, vanished without a trace. Susan, who was about 3 months pregnant, had left her home on foot around 7:30 p.m. to buy groceries at a nearby store, but the market had closed early and she never returned home. Her husband, Paul Lund, became alarmed the next morning when Susan was still missing, and he contacted the Clarksville police to report her disappearance. A multi-agency search was launched and continued for weeks. Early reports noted that Susan might have been upset about the family's financial situation around that time, but there was no concrete evidence explaining her sudden vanishing. After about 2 weeks, police began to scale back the active search amid unconfirmed sightings of Susan in nearby Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Then, in a strange twist, a woman in Alabama came forward in August 1993 claiming to be Susan Lund and told a state trooper she did not want to be bothered. Now let me remind you, so you don't have to rewind, the Ina Jane Doe was discovered in January 1993. Based on this encounter, authorities in mid-1993 concluded that Susan had left voluntarily, and they closed the missing person case as resolved. Susan's family was incredulous at this outcome, and they personally traveled to Alabama and confirmed the woman was an imposter. In a further unusual twist, the authorities decided to believe the imposter over Susan's family and refused to reopen the investigation. For nearly 29 years, the Ina Jane Doe's identity and Susan Lund's fate remained parallel unsolved puzzles. The case in Illinois periodically drew interest from detectives and amateur sleuths, but without new evidence it remained stagnant. In early 2021, hope resurfaced when Dr. Amy Michael, a forensic anthropologist, offered to re-examine the Jane Doe case with modern techniques. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office welcomed her fresh eyes on the case and provided the preserved remains and case files to Dr. Michael's team. Dr. Michael and her team conducted a detailed reanalysis of the skull and archival records. They discovered that the victim's facial asymmetry had likely been much milder in life than initially thought. This finding suggested that the original reconstructions might have distorted her appearance and severely hindered any potential recognition. Determined to correct the record, the team commissioned a new, more accurate forensic sketch. And this is one of those times you may want to check your screen if you're just watching, because I've put the reconstruction beside the forensic sketch, and it's night and day. Investigators circulated the new renderings in hopes that someone would finally recognize the long-lost victim. At the same time, due to the increased attention on her case, forensic DNA technology was brought to bear. In 2021, samples from the unknown woman's remains were sent to a specialized lab in California to extract DNA suitable for genealogical analysis. By early 2022, scientists had obtained a usable genetic profile from the remains and uploaded it to a public genealogy database. Remarkably, within one day, the forensic genealogists found multiple close DNA matches pointing to a particular family tree. They identified a couple in that family who had a missing daughter named Susan Lund, and tellingly, this daughter had no recorded activity after 1992. Law enforcement followed up by contacting Susan's siblings, one of whom provided a DNA sample for direct comparison. On March 6, 2022, nearly 30 years after the crime, officials confirmed that Susan Lund was indeed the Ina Jane Doe. This breakthrough solved two mysteries at once: an unidentified victim in Illinois and a missing persons case in Tennessee, but it also marked the beginning of a renewed hunt for the perpetrator. The identification of the Ina Jane Doe as Susan Lund was a watershed moment for both Susan's family and the investigators. Susan's relatives, including her sisters and now adult children, were overcome with mixed emotions. They felt profound relief at finally knowing what happened to her, and anger and sorrow at the suffering she endured. Detectives from Illinois began coordinating with authorities in Clarksville to piece together Susan's final days and generate new leads. One chilling clue that emerged after Susan's identity was established came from old reports in Illinois. Several campers and fishermen recalled seeing a headless body in a lake around the time the head was discovered in 1993. Oddly, it appears these reports were never fully pursued, meaning Susan's body may have simply been left in the lake. At present, there's a lot of theories going around about what may have happened. One theory focuses on the possibility of domestic foul play. Susan's husband, Paul Lund, was the last known person to see her alive, and some have speculated about the possibility of his involvement. Internet sleuths have speculated that Susan may have recently informed her husband that she was pregnant, leading to an outbreak of violence. However, it must be noted that Paul Lund was never charged and has never officially been named as a suspect. Further, he died in 2020, 2 years before Susan was identified. Another avenue of speculation posits that Susan Lund fell victim to an unknown predator or serial perpetrator. Susan disappeared while walking alone at night, and her remains were found across state lines, which could indicate a random abduction by someone passing through the area. Anyway, with all that said, I hope to have a further update on Susan Lund at some point in the near future. The glass delusion was a peculiar psychiatric phenomenon recorded in Europe during the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Individuals suffering from this delusion believed that they were made of glass and feared that any sudden movement or impact would cause them to shatter into pieces. Such people often refused to be touched or even approached, convinced that the slightest contact could break their fragile glass-like bodies. Notably, This condition was most frequently observed among the educated upper classes. Early modern physicians and writers classified it as an unusual manifestation of melancholy. This was essentially an extreme anxiety or fear within the framework of humoral medicine. One of the most famous sufferers of the glass delusion was King Charles VI of France, who lived between 1368 and 1422. Charles VI ascended the throne as a boy and was initially known as Charles the Beloved for his enlightened leadership. However, he experienced a mental breakdown in 1392 that marked the onset of a lifelong psychosis. During his bouts of insanity, Charles became convinced that his body was entirely made of glass. He refused to allow anyone to touch him and took elaborate precautions to avoid shattering. For example, the king would sit motionless for hours, sometimes wrapped in thick blankets to protect himself. He even wore specially made garments reinforced with iron rods, described as iron ribs, to safeguard his supposedly fragile glass organs. These bizarre behaviors earned him the epithet Charles the Mad amongst later historians. Charles VI's case is often cited as the first known instance of glass delusion in history, and it vividly illustrates how real and debilitating this belief was for the afflicted individual. In the 15th through the 17th centuries, the glass delusion cropped up in royal courts, monasteries, and universities across Europe. An influential 16th century account by a court physician told of an unnamed nobleman who believed he was made of glass. Specifically, he believed his body was actually a glass vase. This nobleman reportedly spent long periods lying on a bed of straw to avoid cracking himself. According to the story, his doctor devised a dramatic cure. The physician set the straw on fire and locked the door, forcing the panicked patient to frantically pound on the walls for help. When the man didn't shatter from this vigorous slamming, the doctor allegedly challenged his delusion, and the nobleman came to realize that he wasn't truly made of glass. This anecdote, whether apocryphal or factual, suggests that even in the 1500s, doctors recognized the delusion as a false belief and attempted creative psychological interventions to treat it. Notably, some modern scholars question whether such a delusion could be broken so easily, given what we now know about mental health conditions. Many variations of the glass delusion were documented. Some patients believed only a part of their body was glass, for instance, a glass head, glass arms, or a glass heart that could splinter inside them. A particularly widespread fear, apparently affecting men in particular, was that the sufferer had acquired a quote-unquote glass buttocks. Men who held this belief would avoid sitting down without some padding, fearing that their posterior would shatter upon contact with a hard seat. Contemporary medical theory in the late medieval and Renaissance periods explained the glass delusion within the prevailing framework of melancholia. Melancholy, associated with an excess of black bile in traditional medicine, was thought to produce all manner of fears and false beliefs. Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, released in 1621, famously catalogues a variety of bizarre delusions afflicting people with melancholy. He noted that some people believe they're made of glass, while others believe that they're made of lead or cork or other materials. Treatments were largely empirical and compassionate in nature. Physicians might gently reason with patients, or, as in the case of the straw bed fire cure, try to shock the patient back to his senses. The approach indicates that doctors understood the problem to lie in the patient's belief, rather than in any physical issues within the body. Modern scholars have proposed additional explanations for why the glass delusion appeared when and where it did. Glass was a rare and valuable product at the time, and some have seen it as almost the equivalent of having been touched by Midas himself, if Midas turned objects into high-quality glass. One psychological interpretation is that cases like King Charles VI represent early descriptions of severe mental illness on the psychotic spectrum. Retrospective diagnosis is speculative, but some historians and psychiatrists have suggested that Charles VI's condition might be described today as schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. Indeed, chronic schizophrenia often involves false beliefs about one's body, and the glass delusion could be seen as a culturally shaped version of that clinical phenomenon. Notably, the glass delusion was both time-bound and culture-bound. By the late 17th century, cases of glass delusion had all but disappeared, with only a few cases reported throughout the entirety of the 20th century. Marlene Santana was just 3 days old when she was forcibly abducted from her mother's arms in Brooklyn, New York, on October 21, 1985. The kidnapping occurred outside Brookdale Hospital, as Marlene's mother was leaving the maternity ward to take her newborn daughter home. Moments earlier, Marlene's mother, 23-year-old Francesca Santana, had encountered an unfamiliar woman near the nursery. This woman openly admired her baby, calling little Marlene, quote, the prettiest and most quiet infant there. Francesca appreciated the kind words and had no reason to suspect the stranger's intentions. She could not have imagined that this same woman would soon turn a joyful day into a nightmare. That evening, around 9:30 p.m., as Francesca left the hospital accompanied by her little one and her relatives, the same woman confronted them, holding a weapon. The stranger announced she had been waiting all day and suddenly pointed the weapon at the baby's head, threatening to shoot if they did not cooperate. The terrified mother and her 2 companions were forced to walk about 6 blocks away from the hospital into a desolate area near a junkyard. Initially, Francesca thought it might be a robbery, but the true motive became clear when the woman demanded that Marlene be handed over. Desperate to save her child's life, Francesca complied, and after all, what choice did she have when this woman had a weapon pointed at Marlene? In a final plea, the distraught mother even gave the abductor her phone number and begged her to call. The kidnapper then jumped into a waiting car driven by an accomplice and sped away with baby Marlene. With that, the Santana family's newborn daughter had vanished into the night, never to be seen again. Shocked and heartbroken, Francesca and her relatives rushed to notify the police immediately after the abduction. Investigators quickly mobilized, and detectives were assigned to the case within hours. Francesca was able to provide details of the getaway vehicle, describing it as a white 1976 Chevy Malibu with red lettering on the door. This car was possibly an unlicensed taxi, which suggested the abductor had planned her escape in advance. At the hospital, police interviewed staff and witnesses to gather a description of the unknown woman who had interacted with the baby's mother. A sketch of the suspect was soon drawn from these accounts. And yes, this is one of those times where you're going to want to look at the screen if you just listen. I've seen a lot of police sketches before, but this woman's malevolence and cruelty is somehow perfectly captured by the forensic artist. The woman was described as being around 5'2" and appeared to be in her mid to late 20s in 1985. Witnesses noted she had light reddish blonde hair, but that it was possibly dyed or a wig. According to witnesses, she was identified as likely being a Hispanic female, which some speculate may be why she targeted Marlene Santana, but I'll come back to that. From the beginning, law enforcement suspected that the kidnapper's motive was deeply personal rather than financial. There was no ransom demand or contact from the abductor despite the mother's plea to call her. Some investigators theorized that the culprit was not a professional criminal, but rather an emotionally unstable woman who was unable to have a child of her own. This profile fit a pattern seen in some infant abductions. A woman who has suffered a miscarriage or stillbirth, and in desperation, abducts a baby to raise as her own. Because in these cases the woman was already pregnant, the woman can simply register the abducted baby as her own, claiming that she gave birth at home. Notably, some have speculated that the mysterious woman may have abducted Marlene because she looked like she could plausibly be her own baby. Detectives pursued this angle by checking hospital records and investigating women in the area who had recently lost a baby or suffered a miscarriage. Despite these efforts, no viable suspect was identified. The trail was frustratingly cold, with the abductor having vanished without leaving clear clues to her identity. I do have to question how this woman had access to the maternity ward without leaving some form of identification with staff. But that said, I suppose maternity wards are accustomed to having visitors come and go, and security and privacy regulations in the 80s were different beasts than they are today. In a strange coincidence, another infant was kidnapped in New York City just one day before Marlene's abduction. On October 20th, 1985, a 2-month-old boy named Christopher Morgan was snatched from a Manhattan hospital by a woman impersonating a nurse. That case, however, saw a swift resolution. The baby boy was found safe a few days later at the home of his abductor. She had tried to pass him off as her own child after experiencing a stillbirth. Police soon arrested that woman and determined that her crime was unrelated to Marlene's disappearance. In the days and weeks following Marlene's abduction, the case received significant media attention in the New York area. Francesca made heart-wrenching public pleas for her daughter's return. Despite widespread news coverage and the dissemination of the suspect's sketch, detectives reported no major leads in Marlene's case. The lack of progress was understandably agonizing for the family. As months turned into years with no answers, the Santanas were left to grapple with fear and grief. Marlene's father, Thomas, had been in the Dominican Republic at the time of the birth, and after the incident, he and Francesca decided it was too painful to remain in the United States. They returned home to raise their other children, all while keeping hope alive that Marlene might one day be found. The family went on to have 2 more children back in the Dominican Republic. While some have suggested the family leaving the United States is potentially suspicious, the authorities have ruled out the family as being involved in the crime. Further, all members of the family were always fully cooperative and open with the police and the investigation. On the investigative front, Marlene's case has remained open and periodically received renewed attention. The way I personally found out about this case was through an old segment on Unsolved Mysteries, and like many, the case has always stuck with me given the horror of it. This segment initially aired in January 1989 and was periodically re-aired over the following decades before making its way onto streaming services. This segment has led to hundreds of leads over the years, but none have panned out. Agencies have released age-progressed images to show what Marlene might look like as she grew older. Law enforcement also publicized a distinctive detail that could help identify Marlene. She was born with a slight foot deformity, causing her feet to curve inward in a C shape. If Marlene is alive, this congenital trait might still be observable and serve as a clue to her identity. Today, Marlene would be nearly 40 years old, and her case remains unsolved. Thankfully, her information is maintained in missing persons databases, including DNA profiles from her biological family, in hopes of a future match. In the absence of a resolution, several theories have been explored regarding what happened to baby Marlene. The prevailing theory among law enforcement is that the abductor was a woman desperate for a child to call her own. And since I've already gone over that theory, there's no need to rehash it. Another theory considered both by authorities and the public is that Marlene might have been abducted for an illegal adoption or baby selling scheme. In the mid-1980s, there were fears of underground networks that would obtain infants and sell them to adoptive parents willing to pay. It's conceivable that the woman who took Marlene was acting as a broker or agent for such a black market adoption. Under this scenario, Marlene could have been handed off to another individual or family shortly after the abduction and raised far from New York. Some have speculated she might even have been taken out of the country as an infant, making her much harder to trace. However, investigators generally doubt that this was a professionally planned crime. The abductor's brazen approach, grabbing a baby in person with a weapon, and her emotional interaction with the mother suggest a crime of opportunity fueled by personal emotion. Notably, while trafficking operations do exist, no evidence of a wider adoption ring was ever uncovered in connection with Marlene's disappearance. On occasion, women of roughly Marlene's age have come forward, wondering if they might be the missing child, especially if they grew up without birth records or with uncertain family histories. Authorities have investigated a few such cases, including conducting DNA tests to check for a match to Marlene's family, but so far none have confirmed her identity. The authorities continue to work under the belief that Marlene is alive, or at least that she wasn't slain by her abductor. While it is possible that Marlene did not survive long after the abduction, there is no direct evidence of harm, and the consensus of investigators is that the kidnapper wanted the baby alive. So I feel like I've said this many times before, but this is a case that will likely be solved through the popularization of DNA testing services. If Marlene did survive, I imagine that one day she may hand her DNA over to find out all the details on her background and find out she has a bunch of familial connections that make no sense. Marlene's immediate family still lives in the Dominican Republic, but I hope they've entered their DNA into all the big testing services so they can match if this ever occurs. 13-year-old Russell Evans was a popular 8th grader in Spokane, Washington, known for his love of basketball and friendly personality. On the night of June 3rd, 1989, he spent time hanging out with friends at a local park in Spokane's South Hill neighborhood. In the early hours of June 4th, Russell was found gravely injured on a residential roadway near his home after what appeared to be a hit-and-run incident. He was barely conscious and repeatedly calling out the name Brian as passers-by quickly rushed to assist him. Russell was taken to Sacred Heart Hospital around 1:30 a.m., but despite emergency surgery and hours of effort, he succumbed to his injuries later that morning. His unexplained death would spark a years-long quest for answers. On June 3, 1989, a few hours before the tragedy, Russell and his best friend Aaron were at Thornton Murphy Park, enjoying a typical weekend evening. The mood shifted when two older teenagers, unfamiliar to Russell and Aaron, approached and began harassing Aaron's girlfriend, allegedly trying to give her a phone number. An argument erupted, nearly turning physical until Russell intervened to defend his friend. And one thing about Russell you should know is that despite being 13 years old, he already stood 6'3", so he was no easy target for these older teens. One of the older teens issued a parting threat as they left, warning that he might, quote, send his homeboys after Russell and Aaron. One of the teens even shouted further violent threats before driving off, strongly implying that said homeboys weren't looking to throw down in accordance with Queensberry rules. Unsettled, Russell and his friends decided to leave the park. Russell spent the next few hours at another friend's house to cool off. Just after midnight, at about 12:30 a.m. on June 4th, he phoned his father to say he was on his way home. Russell began the short walk home through the quiet neighborhood. Along the way, he ran into a friend, 14-year-old Syed Madison, and the two chatted briefly before parting. Madison would be the last person confirmed to see Russell alive. Around 1 a.m., a driver named Sandy Ferris and her friend were coming down South Thor Street when her headlights caught a shocking sight: Russell's body lying in the road near the median. Sandy stopped and rushed to help. She found Russell badly injured but conscious. When she asked what happened, he was in pain and kept calling for someone named Brian. She believed that he was calling out to Brian, believing that he would come to his rescue. Also keep the name Brian in mind because we're going to come back to him shortly. Sandy immediately called for an ambulance, and paramedics arrived and noted Russell's severe injuries, which were apparently consistent with a vehicle impact. Notably, the paramedics found that Russell wasn't wearing any shoes, something which will become a point of contention. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Tragically, despite doctors' efforts through the night, Russell succumbed to severe internal injuries on the morning of June 4th, 1989. Investigators from the Spokane Police Department treated the case as a fatal hit-and-run accident from the start. Physical evidence at the scene strongly supported the possibility of a car strike. Russell's shoes had been knocked off his feet by the force of impact and were found about 75 feet away from where his body came to rest. The Spokane authorities explained that upon impact, his shoes likely flew from his body, an explanation that many amateurs and professionals have found dubious at best. Notably, the forensic pathologist examined the injuries and concluded they were consistent with being struck from behind by a vehicle bumper. Investigators even speculated about the type of vehicle, suggesting an unknown driver, possibly in a pickup truck given Russell's height and the wound locations, hit him and fled the scene. Because Russell had been involved in a dispute earlier that night, police questioned the two teens from the park altercation to rule out any deliberate attack. Both teens denied any involvement or being in a gang, and each passed a lie detector test. By the end of that first week, authorities publicly ruled out their involvement in Russell's death. With no eyewitness to the collision and no immediate suspects, the working theory remained that Russell was the victim of an unknown hit-and-run driver unconnected to the night's events. Unsatisfied with the initial conclusions, the Evans family launched their own investigation. After reviewing the police reports and scene photographs, John and Sue Evans became convinced that Russell had been attacked before any car ever hit him. They noted that Russell's injuries looked more like the result of a physical altercation. He had bruises on his face and arms that looked consistent with an assault, as if someone had grabbed and punched him. Strikingly, he lacked the deep scrapes or road rash one would expect if a body his size had been hurled across pavement at high speed. Fortunately, his family had the means to hire a second pathologist to review the case, because if they weren't able to do this, this is likely where the investigation would have ground to a halt. This expert agreed that there were signs Russell had been in a physical altercation prior to his death, noting bruised knuckles and unexplained trauma on his back. This pathologist agreed that a vehicle impact occurred at some point, but also concluded Russell fought for his life that night. Given the lack of road rash on Russell's body, the family, with the assistance of the pathologist, came up with an alternative theory. They believed that Russell was ambushed and beaten while walking home, then held in place and struck with a vehicle to make the whole event look like a much more routine hit and run. The mysterious Brian, whom Russell cried out for, also became a focus of inquiry. It turns out Brian was a close friend of Russell's who lived nearby. Curiously, on the night of the supposed hit and run, someone named Brian had called the hospital asking about Russell's condition very soon after the incident. Russell's family found this suspicious, given that no one could have known that he was in the emergency room at that hour unless they were at the scene. Sandy Ferris, the motorist who found Russell, reported that as police arrived, she saw a teenage boy in white shorts lurking on a hillside near the site, who then ran off into the darkness. She immediately told an officer, but in the chaos, the information was not pursued at the time. John Evans, Russell's dad, confronted Russell's friend Brian the next day, asking what he had been wearing that night. Brian allegedly said he'd worn white shorts and a white t-shirt, matching the figure Sandy saw, but swore he wasn't in the area when Russell was hit. Later, when police interviewed Brian, he oddly denied even owning white shorts. These inconsistencies fueled the family's suspicions that Brian knew more than he was admitting. Some have speculated Brian may have been with Russell during the attack, but was scared into silence by the perpetrators. The police, however, disagreed and believed that the person Sandy Ferris saw was likely a random bystander drawn to the area by the commotion. To this day, the exact role, if any, of Brian in Russell's last moments remains an open question. By late 1989, despite the Evans family's pleas, Spokane police maintained there was insufficient proof of foul play, and the case began to turn cold. In 1996, John and Sue Evans hired a private investigator to re-examine the case, and this spurred new witnesses to come forward with some disturbing accounts. Now, I should mention here that these statements are based largely upon what these individuals heard other people saying these gang members said. Yeah, so not the most reliable form of evidence, and I don't put incredible evidentiary weight on it, but it's something. According to statements collected by the investigator, local gang members had bragged about assaulting Russell with a club and then running him over with a car. The statements also suggest the group discussed creating an alibi and threatening anyone who knew the truth into keeping quiet. Based on these leads, the Evans family identified specific individuals they believed were responsible, and even a vehicle that might have been used in the crime. Despite these revelations, law enforcement's stance barely shifted. Spokane police said they did investigate the new tips, but in their view, the evidence still wasn't strong enough to overcome the original accident ruling. According to them, the teens implicated by the witnesses had already been cleared earlier, and prosecutors declined to file any charges without direct proof. Anyway, the Russell Evans case really doesn't sit right with me. There are too many inconsistencies, too many details that don't line up with a simple hit and run. Even if the truth can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, it's fairly clear that something more sinister than a simple hit and run happened that night. Unfortunately, given the passage of time and given the way the investigation was handled, I find it difficult to believe that the truth will ever be fully known for Russell's case. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Now let's get back to business. The disappearance of 19-year-old Sonja Engelbrecht in April 1995 has become one of Germany's most notorious cold cases. Engelbrecht went missing on the night of April 10, 1995 in Munich, and for decades her fate remained unknown. On April 10, 1995, Sonja went out for the evening with a close friend. They met at Munich's Central Station around 9:15 p.m. and went to a bar popular with the alternative music crowd. After a few hours out, the pair left for home around 2 a.m. on April 11th. They walked to Stiegelmeierplatz, a central square, where Sonja intended to call her sister from a payphone for a ride. As they reached the square around 2:30 a.m., her companion saw his night train arriving. He quickly handed Sonja his phone card and ran to catch the train, leaving her alone at the phone booth. And I want you to remember the fact that this companion said she was both in the phone booth and had the phone card the last he saw her. Because trust me, this will be important. That was the last time Sonja was seen alive, and no trace of her was to be seen again for almost 3 decades. Sonja's parents reported her missing later that day, but the police were initially slow to react. Because Sonja was an adult, and there were no obvious signs of foul play, officers first assumed she might have left on her own and would reappear. Sonja's parents explained to them that this was highly out of character, but even so, no actions were taken, and police reiterated that she would turn up. When this didn't happen, the case was escalated, but by that time it was way too late. About 2 weeks after her disappearance, a special task force was assigned to investigate her disappearance. This team of 6 detectives conducted an extensive investigation, interviewing dozens of witnesses and following up on many tips. Again, though, I need to reiterate that the police took no steps to begin with, likely allowing key evidence to fall through the cracks permanently. Early on, the friend who had been with Sonia that night was thoroughly questioned and then ruled out as a suspect. Investigators explored various leads, but nothing concrete was found. With no solid clues, police came to believe that Sonia had likely succumbed to foul play, even telling her parents they might have to wait until her body is found to get any answers. And though it feels almost needless to say it, this investigation has faced numerous criticisms over the years. From early on, Sonia's family pushed hard for progress, advocating for their daughter in the media and hiring a private detective. The Engelbrechts also voiced significant doubts about the timeline provided by Sonia's companion. Notably, his story has a potentially significant hole. Sonia's sister never received the phone call she was supposed to make, despite the fact that the male friend left her in the phone booth with the calling card. Despite the suspicions, police maintained that the friend's account matched all investigative findings and reaffirmed that he was not involved. By the late 1990s, with no leads or official suspects, the case went cold. In the ensuing years, investigators periodically revisited Sonia's case, and the media kept it in the public eye. In 2010, a TV segment about the case prompted several women to report that a strange man had approached them in Munich on the night Sonia disappeared. Unfortunately, these women had not given this information to the initial investigators back in 1995, and ultimately this individual was never identified. The case continued to attract national attention throughout Germany over the course of the 2010s, leading police to continue to make an effort to solve what was then her disappearance. And just to go off script here for a second, this is one of the reasons why discussing cold cases is so important. The authorities, as a general rule, seem to apply their limited investigative resources to cold cases proportionally to how well publicized a case is. A major turning point in the case came in mid-2020. In a forest near Kipfenberg, about 50 miles north of Munich, a forestry worker discovered a human thigh bone. In November 2021, it was publicly announced that DNA tests confirmed the bone was Sonia's, conclusively proving that she was deceased. In March 2022, police organized a thorough search of the area and found additional bones in a hidden crevice not far from the first site. Notably, her body had been wrapped in heavy construction-style plastic sheets. This suggested the perpetrator may have been someone with easy access to such materials, such as a tradesman. Interestingly, there was a construction trade show being held in Munich around that time, though this may be more of a complicating factor than anything. Notably, the trade show drew people from around Europe and worldwide, potentially meaning the perpetrator wasn't even from Munich, let alone Germany. Police also presented fragments of a blanket found with the remains, and an audience tip later helped identify the blanket's manufacturer. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about what happened to Sonia Engelbrecht. Sonia's parents developed their own hypotheses in the absence of answers. Their major concern was over some of the holes in Sonia's companion's story from that night. However, they also explored a number of alternative ideas as well. They feared she might have been abducted by a trafficking ring or even targeted by occult groups. Police have dismissed these theories, believing that she likely fell victim to something just as unsettling and disturbing: a chance predator who happened upon Sonia that night. They believe she either willingly got into a stranger's car or was forced, because otherwise someone likely would have noticed her walking alone at that late hour. Investigators have not been able to provide any clear motive given the condition of her remains. Various other theories have also circulated in the media and among the public. Some have speculated about a serial perpetrator, noting other young women disappeared in Munich in the early to mid-1990s under vaguely similar circumstances. In a strange twist, a couple who went missing in 2002, were also discovered in Kipfenberg Forest in 2020. This has led the public to theorize that this forest had been used as a dump site by a serial perpetrator, but as yet, no evidence has conclusively proven this. In the pre-dawn hours of July 17, 1988, 22-year-old Lisa Moss left a house party near the village of Woodford, Ontario in Canada, and vanished into the darkness. Lisa had recently moved back to her parents' home in Owen Sound just the day before and was 5 months pregnant at the time. That Saturday night, she met up with friends, 2 women and a male acquaintance, for a night out. They left Lisa's green 1976 Plymouth Fury at the male friend's rented farmhouse in Annan, near Woodford, and all carpooled to a party down a long farm lane. Sometime around 4:30 a.m., Lisa and the male friend returned to his farmhouse so she could retrieve her car. Lisa drove off into the rural darkness, turning left out of the driveway, and was never seen again. When Lisa failed to come home, her family and the Ontario Provincial Police began searching the area. 2 days after her disappearance, a farmer discovered Lisa's Plymouth Fury abandoned on a secluded, muddy dirt road near Annan. The scene was ominous. The car was stuck in mud with its doors and trunk left wide open. It looked as though someone had tried desperately to free the vehicle from the muck, as mud was sprayed behind the tires. Inside the car, however, there was no sign of Lisa. Investigators combed the vicinity for clues. In the following weeks, searchers found Lisa's driver's license and some personal belongings discarded in tall grass along a road several miles east of where the car was found. The license lay atop the tall grass, suggesting it had been tossed from a moving vehicle. These discoveries deepened suspicions of foul play. Despite extensive ground and air searches in the rural farms and woods of Grey County, no trace of Lisa herself was found in 1988. In the early stages, the mysterious disappearance of a young woman from a quiet community left residents on edge. That summer of 1988, another local woman had also vanished under puzzling circumstances just weeks earlier, heightening fears of a serial predator. Police received numerous tips and interviewed many people. Originally, 7 possible suspects were identified in Lisa's case. All people in her life were present around the time she went missing. Both Lisa's estranged husband, from whom she had separated 6 months prior, and the male friend she had argued with the night before, were looked at but were not considered suspects. Investigators conducted over 150 interviews in the case and pursued leads across the region. Sadly, despite all these initial efforts, her case went cold. By 2009, the investigation, now handled by the OPP's Cold Case Unit, had honed in on a single suspect after years of work. The authorities conducted multiple searches of a particular property in Owen Sound, starting in 2010, using both forensic teams and ground-penetrating radar. Despite these efforts, no meaningful evidence was turned up in the search. Over the years, several theories have emerged about what happened to Lisa Moss, all of which involve foul play. From the evidence, detectives strongly suspect Lisa met with harm at the hands of someone she trusted. While investigators have not named a primary suspect, there is significant suspicion on the male friend who was last with her in the early morning of July 17th. This man, a casual acquaintance who gave Lisa a ride to her car, was among those questioned early on. However, without concrete evidence, no charges have ever been laid. Other early suspects, including Lisa's ex-husband and former boyfriend, were cleared by police and are no longer thought to be involved. However, some suggest that the police may not have looked closely enough into these individuals to rule them out. Another theory is that she was abducted by a stranger after her vehicle became caught in the mud. According to this theory, someone may have pulled over under the guise of helping her, or she may have wandered off to try to find help, only to encounter a real-life monster. All that said, there's no evidence that a random stranger abducted Lisa, but authorities haven't been able to fully rule it out. One major fact I wasn't able to conclusively uncover when I was researching this case is who the father of her baby was. Sadly, pregnant women are at a greatly elevated risk of violence, and this violence is almost always directed at them from the individual who got them pregnant. At any rate, it sounds as though the police likely have a very good idea who committed this act, but simply don't have the key evidence they need to prosecute the crime. For the time being, Lisa remains officially classified as a missing person until evidence proves otherwise. Queen's Day is a popular national holiday in the Netherlands, traditionally celebrated with outdoor festivities and a royal family visit to a town or city. In 2009, Queen Beatrix and her family chose Apeldoorn, a city about 50 miles east of Amsterdam, as the site of the celebrations. The royal family spent the morning greeting well-wishers and were riding in an open-top bus as part of a parade route through the city. The atmosphere was festive, with crowds dressed in orange, the national color, lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the Queen and her entourage on what was expected to be a joyous day. No one anticipated that the day would be marred by violence. Around noon on April 30th, 2009, as the royal parade was nearing its end, chaos erupted. A black Suzuki Swift driven by 38-year-old Karst Tates broke through barriers and plowed into the crowd gathered along the route. Bystanders watched in horror as the car hurtled at high speed toward the royal procession, striking spectators in its path. The vehicle missed the bus carrying Queen Beatrix and her family by only a few feet, then crashed into a stone monument on the roadside. Members of the royal family witnessed the incident. Television footage showed Queen Beatrix gasping and bringing her hand to her mouth in shock as the car careened past. In the immediate chaos, shoes and other debris were seen flying through the air, and people initially thought a traffic accident had occurred before realizing it was a deliberate act. The impact of the car left a scene of devastation. Sadly, 7 people in the crowd were slain almost instantly, and dozens more were horrifically injured. Tates himself was gravely injured in the crash. Police and emergency responders pulled him from the wrecked vehicle and took him into custody at the scene. He was reportedly bleeding and semi-conscious, but in those moments he confessed to police that his actions were intentional and aimed at the royal family. Despite his intended targets being members of the royal family, Tates only managed to cause harm to the individuals in the crowd. As the shocking news spread, authorities swiftly canceled the remainder of the Queen's Day celebrations nationwide. Within hours of the attack, the Queen delivered an emotional televised address to the nation expressing her family's grief and disbelief at the horrific events. Investigators immediately began piecing together Karst Tates' background and possible motives, but many questions remained unanswered. Tates, a Dutch national from the town of Hussen, had no criminal record and no known history of mental health concerns. Police confirmed that they believed that he had acted alone and that there was no indication of any involvement with any radical groups. Early speculation suggests that the vehicle had been rigged up to explode, but the authorities publicly dismissed this in the aftermath. Authorities found that the attack was clearly premeditated, but it was not meticulously planned or executed with sophistication. Several theories about why Tates committed the attack have been discussed by officials, media, and those who knew him. Investigators and journalists uncovered signs that Tates was perhaps a desperate man driven by personal problems. Earlier in 2009, he had lost his job as a night security guard and was reportedly facing imminent eviction from his home. Neighbors described him as normally polite and unremarkable, but noted that he had become reclusive and weird in the months leading up to the attack. Notably, they advised authorities that while he was normally a pretty straight-laced guy, During this period, he adopted a mohawk and started dressing like Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. Now, I'm no psychologist, but when people other than edgy teenagers start comparing themselves to Travis Bickle or the Joker or similar characters, it can often be a sign of trouble to come. In the months leading up to the attack, he also cut himself off from all his friends and family. This has led to the theory that he saw the Queen's Day Parade as an opportunity for a mission of vengeance against society after his personal life unraveled. Indeed, the dramatic nature of the act, targeting the beloved monarch in front of a live TV audience, suggests he wanted to make a public statement of his anguish or anger. Mixed evidence emerged, with some suggesting Tates harbored resentment specifically toward the royal family, while other evidence suggested he was fairly ambivalent towards them. A police officer who questioned Tates in the wrecked car recounted that Karst appeared to question whether the Queen had been taken out. His statements given to that officer were muddled, but appeared to express fairly unhinged beliefs about the Queen and the Dutch royal family. That said, he was suffering from a massive and soon-to-be lethal head injury when this discussion with the police officer occurred. However, those who knew him, including his parents, insisted that Tates had never expressed any significant anti-monarchy sentiments in the past. In fact, according to his family, he had spoken positively of Queen Beatrix as a stabilizing figure, though he had expressed a preference to abolish the Dutch monarchy peacefully. No manifesto or any form of writings were found to give any further insight into his reasoning behind the violence. The official investigation confirmed that while Tates was critical of the monarchy, he didn't appear to subscribe to any coherent ideology or cause that would explain the attack. Ultimately, the motive for the attack remains elusive, and the prosecutor concluded that Tates's exact reasons would never be fully explained.